SYLVIA WYNTER, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being/Power/Truth/Freedom Towards the Human After Man, Its Overrepresentation. Part 1. The Janus Face of the Invention of Man, Laws of Nature and the Thinkability of Natural rather than Supernatural versus the Dynamics of the Colonizer/Colonized Answer to the Question of Who/What we are. This enormous act of expression/narration was paradoxical. It was to be implemented by the West and its intellectuals as indeed a Big Bang process by which it/they were to initiate the first gradual desupernaturalizing of our modes of being human by means of its/their reinvention of the theocentric descriptive statement Christian as that of man in two forms. The first was from the Renaissance to the 18th century, the second from then on until today, thereby making possible both the conceptualizability of natural causality and of nature as an autonomously functioning force in its own right governed by its own laws, i.e. cursus solitus naturae. With this in turn making possible the cognitively emancipatory rise and gradual development of the physical sciences, in the wake of the invention of man 1, and then of the biological sciences, in the wake of the 19th century of man 2. These were to be processes made possible only on the basis of the dynamics of the colonizer/colonized relation that the West was to discursively constitute and empirically institutionalize on the islands of the Caribbean, and later on the mainlands of the Americas. This seeing that if, as Keanu rightly insists, race, unlike gender, which has a biogenetically determined anatomical differential correlate onto which each culture's system of gendered oppositions can be anchored, is a purely invented construct that has no such correlate. Keanu 2000. It was this construct that would enable the now globally expanding West to replace the earlier mortal/immortal, natural/supernatural, human/the ancestors, the gods/God distinction as the one on whose basis all human groups had millennially grounded their descriptive statement/prescriptive statements of what it is to be human, and to reground its secularizing own on a newly projected human/subhuman distinction instead. That is, on Keanu's racism/ethnicism complex, Winant's race concept, Mignolo's colonial difference, redefined in terms of the Spanish state's theoretical construct of a by-nature difference between Spaniards and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, a difference designed in Ginas de Sepulveda's 16th century terms as almost a difference between monkeys and men, homunculi and true humans. Race was, therefore, to be, in effect, the non-supernatural but no less extra-human ground, in the reoccupied place of the traditional ancestors/gods, God ground, of the answer that the secularizing West could now give to the Heideggerian question as to the who and what we are. In his 1999 Coloniality Working Group conference presentation, Walter Mignolo perceptively identified one of the consequences of the Big Bang initiation of the colonial difference as that of the fact that, quote, in the imaginary of the modern/colonial world system's sustainable knowledge, disregarded Amerindian ways of knowing and knowledge production that were reduced to curious practices of strange people and, in another domain, were demonized. However, the anthropologist Jacob Pandian, 1985, enables us to see that this epistemological disregard was itself part of an even more central imperative, that of the sustainability of the new mode of being human, of its epical redescription as primarily that of the political subject of the state, man in the transhumed and reoccupied place of the Latin Christian Europe's founding matrix description, Christian, which had defined the human as primarily the religious subject of the church. While if this new descriptive statement, one that was gradually to privatize as well as to harness the matrix Christian identity to the realizing of the modern state's own secular goals of imperial territorial expansion, was also to be effected on the basis of a parallel series of discursive and institutional interventions, there was one that was to be as novel as it was central. This, as Pandian documents, was to be that of the West's transformation of the indigenous peoples of the Americas/the Caribbean, culturally classified as Indians, Indios, Indias, together with the population group of the enslaved peoples of Africa transported across the Atlantic. into the physical reference of its reinvention of medieval Europe's untrue Christian other to its normative true Christian self, as that of the human other to its new descriptive statement of the ostensibly only normal human, man. In his seminal book, Anthropology and the Western Tradition Towards an Authentic Anthropology, 1985, Jacob Pandian enables us to see that within the terms of the Judeo-Christian religious creed, within the terms, therefore, of its variant of the formulation of the general order of existence, correlated postulate of the significant ill, and therefore proposed behavior motivating cure or plan of salvation, that is, defining of all religions, and the physical reference of the conception of the untrue other to the true Christian self, had been the categories of people defined in religious terminology as heretics, or as enemies of Christ, infidels, and pagan idolaters, with Jews serving as the boundary transgressive name of what is evil figures, stigmatized as Christ-killing deicides. In the wake of the West's reinvention of its true Christian self, in the transsumed terms of the rational self of man, however, it was to be the peoples of the militarily expropriated New World territories, i.e. Indians, as well as the enslaved peoples of Black Africa, i.e. Negroes, that were made to reoccupy the matrix slot of otherness, to be made into the physical referent of the idea of the irrational/sub-rational human other, to this first degodded, if still hybridically religio-secular descriptive statement of the human in history as the descriptive statement that would be foundational to modernity. So that rather than sustainable knowledge merely disregarding the other ways of knowing of the Amerindian peoples, as Mignolo contends, Pandian proposes instead that it was to be the discourses of this knowledge, including centrally those of anthropology, that would function to construct all the non-Europeans that encountered, including those whose lands its settlers expropriated and those whom they enslaved or enserfed, as the physical referent of, in the first phase, its irrational or subrational human other to its new descriptive statement of man as a political subject. While the Indians were portrayed as the very acme of the savage, irrational other, the Negroes were assimilated to the former's category, represented as its most extreme form and as the ostensible missing link between rational humans and irrational animals. However, in the wake of the West's second wave of imperial expansion, pari passu with its reinvention of in man now purely biologized terms, it was to be the peoples of Black African descent who would be constructed as the ultimate referent of the racially inferior human other, with the range of the other colonized dark-skinned peoples all classified as natives, now being assimilated to its category, all of these as the ostensible embodiment of the non-evolved backwards other, if to varying degrees, and, as such, the negation of generic normal humanness, ostensibly expressed by and embodied in the peoples of the West. Nevertheless, if the range of native others were now to be classified, as Pandian further explains, on the terms of multiple mythologies, of the savage other, the fossil other, the abnormal other, the timeless ethnographic other, the most salient of all of these was to be that the mythology of the black other of sub-Saharan Africans and their diaspora descendants. It is this population group who would come to be made, several centuries on, into an indispensable function of the enacting of our present Darwinian, disselected by evolution until proven otherwise, descriptive statement of the human on the biocentric model of a natural organism. With this population group's systemic stigmatization, social inferiorization, and dynamically produced material deprivation, thereby serving both to verify the overrepresentation of man as if it were the human, and to legitimate the subordination of the world and well-being of the latter to those of the former. All of this was done in a law-like manner through the systemic stigmatization of the earth, in terms of it being made of a vile and base matter, a matter ontologically different from that which attested to the perfection of the heavens, and thereby, as such, divinely condemned to be fixed and unmoving at the center of the universe as its dregs, because the abode of a post-Adamic fallen mankind had been an indispensable function of the verifying of medieval Latin Christian Europe's then theocentric descriptive statement of human as sinful by nature. In this way, the descriptive statement on which the hegemony of the world of the Church over the lay world was legitimated. Gregory Bateson and Frantz Fanon, thinking and writing during the upheaval of the anti-colonial/social protest movement of the 60s, were both to put forward new conceptions of the human outside the terms of our present ethnoclass conception that define it on the model of the natural organism, as these terms are elaborated by the disciplinary paradigms and overall organization of knowledge of our present episteme. Foucault, 1973. In an essay entitled Conscious Purpose versus Nature, published in 1969, Bateson proposed that in the same way as the physiology and neurology of the human individual function in order to conserve the body and all of the body's physical characteristics, thereby serving as an overall system that conserves descriptive statements about the human as far as his/her body is concerned, so a correlated process can be seen to be at work at the level of the psyche or the soul. To put it another way, not only is the descriptive statement of the psyche/soul determinant of the kind of higher level learning that must take place, seeing that the indispensable function of each such system of learning must be, imperatively, to conserve that descriptive statement, but it is also determinant of the overall range of acquired know-how that is produced by the interactions of the wider society in which each individual finds itself, and as a society whose overall descriptive statement will necessarily be of the same general order as that of the individual at the level of the psyche/soul. All such learning, whether at the micro level of the individual or at the macro level of the society, must therefore function within the terms of what Foucault has identified as a specific regime and or politics of truth. Foucault, 1980-1981. Fanon had then gone on to analyze the systemically negative representation of the person and his African past that defined the curriculum of the French colonial system of the Caribbean island of Martinique, in which he had grown up, one in which, as he notes, no black countervoice had been allowed to exist, in order to reveal why, as a status of the structures of Bateson's systems of learning designed to preserve the status quo, the Antillean Negro had indeed been socialized to be normally anti-Negro. Nor, the argument proposes, was there anything arbitrary about this deliberate blocking out or a disregard of the black voice, of a positive black self-conception. Rather, this blocking out of a black countervoice was, and is itself, defining of the way in which being human, in the terms of our present ethnoclass mode of sociogeny, dictates that self, other, and world should be represented and known. A lay countervoice could no more have normally existed within the terms of the mode of sociogeny of medieval Latin Christian Europe. In consequence, because it is this premise that underlies the interlinked nature of what I have defined, on the basis of Janus' founding concept of the coloniality of power as the coloniality of being/power/truth/freedom, with the logical inference that one cannot unsettle the coloniality of power without a redescription of the human outside the terms of our present descriptive statement of the human, man, and its overrepresentation, outside the terms of the natural organism answer that we will give to the question of the who and the what that we are, the argument will first link this premise to a fundamental thesis developed by Nicholas Humphrey in his book A History of the Mind, Evolution and the Birth of Consciousness, published in 1992. It will then link both to the 16th century dispute between Bartolomé de las Casas, the missionary priest, on the one hand, and the humanist royal historian and apologist for the Spanish settlers of the San Domingo, Ginés de Sepúlveda, on the other, as a dispute that it will define as one between two descriptive statements of the human. One for which the expansion of the Spanish state was envisaged as a function of Christian evangelizing mission, the other for which the latter mission was seen as a function of the imperial expansion of the state. A dispute, then, between the theocentric conception of the human, Christian, and the new humanist and ratiocentric conception of the human, man too, i.e. as homo politicus, or the political subject of the state. Here, the argument, basing itself on Fanon's and Bateson's redefinition of the human, proposes that the adaptive truth for terms in which each purely organic species must know the world is no less true in our human case. That, therefore, our varying ontogeny, sociogeny modes of being human, as inscribed in the terms of each culture's descriptive statement, will necessarily give rise to their varying respective modalities of adaptive truths for, or epistemes, up to and including our contemporary own. Further, that given the biocentric descriptive statement that is instituting of our present mode of sociogeny, the way we at present normatively know self, other, and social world, is no less adaptively true as the condition of the continued production and reproduction of such a genre of being human, and of its order as, before the revolution initiated by the Renaissance humanists, and given the theocentric description statement that had been instituting of the mode of sociogeny of medieval Latin Christian Europe, its subjects had normatively known self, other, as well as their social, physical, and organic worlds, in the adaptively true terms needed for the production and reproduction not only of their then supernaturally legitimated genre of being human, but as well for that of the hierarchical social structures in whose intersubjective field that genre of human could have alone realized itself. And it is with the production and reproduction of the latter, i.e. the social world, that a crucial difference needs to be identified in our human case. This was the difference identified by C.P. Snow when he described our present order of knowledge as one defined by a two-culture divide between the natural sciences on the one hand, whose domains comprise the physical cosmos as well as that of all biological life, and the disciplines of the social sciences and the humanities on the other. Snow, 1993. And although there has been some attempt recently to rebut the hypothesis of this divide, centrally among those the Gulbenkian report on the social sciences prepared by a team of scholars headed by Emanuel Wallerstein and Valentin Madumbe, 1994, the fact remains that while the natural sciences can explain and predict to a large extent the behavior of these non-human worlds, the disciplines of the social sciences and humanities still remain unable to explain and predict the parameters of the ensemble of collective behaviors that are instituting of our contemporary world, to explain, therefore, the why not only of the large-scale inequalities, but also of the overall Janus-faced efforts of large-scale human emancipation, yoked to the no less large-scale human degradation and immiseration to which these behaviors collectively lead. These behaviors, whether oriented by the residual metaphysics of fertility/reproduction of the agrarian age in the poorer parts of the world, or by the metaphysics of productivity and profitability of our techno-industrial one in the rich enclaves, with the one impelling the dynamics of overpopulation and the other that of overconsumption, now collectively threaten the planetary environment of our human species habitat. The argument proposes, in this context, that the still unbreachable divide between the two cultures, a divide that had been briefly challenged by a range of anti-colonial as well as the social cum intellectual movements of the 60s, before these movements were co-opted, lies in the fact that our own disciplines, as literary scholars and social scientists whose domains is our socio-human world, must still continue to function as all human orders of knowledge have done from our origin on the continent of Africa until today, as a language-capacitated form of life, to ensure that we continue to know our present order of social reality, and rigorously so, in the adaptive truth-for terms needed to conserve our present descriptive statement, that is, as one that defines us biocentrically on the model of a natural organism, with this a priori definition serving to orient and motivate the individual and collective behaviors by means of which our contemporary Western world system or civilization, together with its nation-state subunits, are stably produced and reproduced. This at the same time as it ensures that we, as Western and Westernized intellectuals, continue to articulate in however radically oppositional a manner the rules of the social order and its sanctioned theories. Conrad and Seleny, 1979. Recent and still ongoing scholarship on archaeoastronomy has shown that all human orders, from the smallest society of nomadic hunter-gatherers, such as the San people of the Kalahari, to the large-scale societies of Egypt, China, the Greeks, and the Romans, have mapped their descriptive statements, or governing master codes on the heavens, on their stable periodicities and regular reoccurring movements. Krupp, 1997. Because, in doing so, they had thereby mapped their specific criterion of being human, of what it was to be a good man and woman of one's kind. Davis, 1992, onto the physical cosmos, thereby absolutizing each such criteria, and with this enabling them to be experienced by each order's subjects as if they had been supernaturally, and as such extra-humanly, determined criteria. Their respective truths had necessarily come to function as an objective set of facts for the people of that society, seeing that such truths were now the indispensable condition of their existence as such a society, as such people, as such a mode of being human. These truths had therefore both commanded obedience and necessitated the individual and collective behaviors by means of which each such order and its modes of being human were brought into existence, produced, and stably reproduced. This, therefore, meant that all such knowledge of the physical cosmos, all such astronomies, all such geographies, whatever the vast range of human needs that they had successfully met, the range of behaviors they had made possible, indeed, however sophisticated and complex the calculations that they had enabled to be made of the movements of the heavens, as in the case of Egypt and China, had still remained adaptive truths for, and, as such, ethno-astronomies, ethno-geographies. This was no less the case with respect to the long tradition of Greek/Hellenistic astronomy, which a medieval Judeo-Christian Europe would have inherited, since, in spite of the great advances in mathematical astronomy to which its fundamental Platonic postulate, that of an eternal divinized cosmos as contrasted with the earth, which was not only subject to change and corruption, but was fixed and unmoving at the center, has led a long line of astronomers to struggle to save the phenomena, i.e. to reconcile their measurements of the movements of the heavens with this premise. Greek astronomy was to remain an ethno-astronomy, one, that is, in which the moral/political laws of the Greek polis had been projected upon the physical cosmos, enabling them to serve as objective truth, in Feyerabend's 1987 sense of the term, and therefore as, in my own terms, adaptive truth for the Greeks. With the consequence that their projected premise of a value distinction and principle of ontological distinction between heaven and earth had functioned to analogically replicate and absolutize the central order organizing principle and genre of the human distinction at the level of the socio-political order between the non-dependent masters who were Greek-born citizens and their totally dependent enslaved people classified as barbarian others. With this value distinction, sociogenic principle or master code of symbolic life/death, then being replicated at the level of the intra-Greek society, in gendered terms, correlatedly as between males who were citizens and women who were their dependents. In a 1987 interview, the theoretical physicist David Bohm explained why the rise of the physical sciences would have been impossible in ancient Greece, given the role that the physical cosmos had been made to play in stabilizing and legitimating the structures/hierarchies and role allocations of its social order. If each society, Bohm pointed out, bases itself on a general notion of the world that always contains within it a specific idea of order, for the ancient Greeks this idea of order had been projected as that of an increasing perfection from the earth to the heavens. In consequence, in order for modern physics, which is based on the idea of successive positions of bodies of matter and the constraints of forces that act on these bodies, to be developed, the order of perfection investigated by the ancient Greeks had to become irrelevant. In other words, for such an astronomy and physics to be developed, the society that made it possible would have had to be one that no longer had the need to map its ordering principle onto the physical cosmos, as the Greeks and all other human societies had done. The same goes for the need to retain the Greek premise of an ontological difference of substance between the celestial realm of perfection, the realm of true knowledge, and the imperfect realm of the terrestrial, the realm of doxa, of mere opinion, or belief. This was not a mutation that could be easily effected. In his recent book, The Enigma of the Gift, Maurice Godelier reveals an added and even more powerful dimension as to why the mutation by which humans would cease to map the idea of order onto the law-like regularities of physical nature could not be easily come by. This would come to be effected only in the wake of the Renaissance humanists' initiation of the processes that would lead to the de-godding/de-supernaturalization of our modes of being human on the basis of their invention of man in the reoccupied place of their early-matrix theocentric identity, Christian. Although, Godelier writes, as human beings who live in society, and who must also produce society in order to live, we have hitherto always done so by producing at the same time the mechanisms by means of which we have been able to invert cause and effect, allowing us to repress the recognition of our collective production of our modes of social reality, and with it, the argument proposes, the recognition also of the self-inscripted auto-instituted nature of our genres/modes of being human. Central to these mechanisms was the one by which we projected our own authorship of our societies onto the ostensible extrahuman agency of the supernatural imaginary beings. Godelier, 1999. This imperative has been total in the case of all human orders, even where, in the case of our now purely secular order, the extrahuman agency on which our authorship is now projected is no longer supernatural, but rather that of evolution/natural selection together with the imagined entity of race. As if, in our contemporary case, evolution, which pre-adapted us by means of the coevolution of language and the brain to self-inscript and auto-institute our modes of being human, and to thereby artificially program our own behaviors, doing so, as the biologist James Danieli pointed out in a 1980 essay, by means of the discourse of religion, as well as of the secular ones that have now taken their place, still continue to program our hybrid ontogeny, sociogeny behaviors by means of unmediated genetic programs, rather than, as Danieli further argued, all such behaviors being law-likely induced by discursively instituted programs whose good/evil formulations function to activate the biochemical reward/punishment mechanism of the brain, as a mechanism that, while common to all species, functions in the case of humans in terms specific to each such narratively inscribed and discursively elaborated descriptive statement, and thereby to its modes of the I, and correlated symbolically/altruistically bonded mode of the eusocial we. Danieli, 1980. If, as David Bohm pointed out, the Greeks' idea of order had been mapped upon degrees of perfection projected upon the physical cosmos as degrees of rational perfection extending from the apex of the heavens' degrees to the non-homogeneous nadir of the earth's, with the rise in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire of a now Christian Europe, while the classical Greco-Roman, i.e. Ptolemaic astronomy, had given expression to the Greek idea of order was to be carried over. It was to be Christianized within the terms of Christianity's new descriptive statement of the human, based on its master code of the redeemed spirit, as actualized in the celibate clergy, and the fallen flesh enslaved to the negative legacy of Adamic original sin, as actualized by laymen and women. Hence the logic by which medieval Latin Christian Europe's notion of the world and idea of order would become one of degrees of spiritual perfection, at the same time as it would remain mapped onto the same space of otherness principle of non-homogeneity, Godzik, 1986. With the result that on the basis of this projection, the medieval Latin Christian subject's sensory perception of a motionless earth would have verified for them not only the postulate of mankind's justly condemned enslavement to the negative Adamic legacy, but even more centrally the sinful by nature descriptive statement of the human, in whose terms they both experience themselves as Christians, being therefore thereby behaviorally impelled to seek redemption from their enslavement through the sacraments of the Church, as well as by adhering to its prohibitions, and to thereby strive to attain its otherworldly goal, that of divine election for eternal salvation in the Augustinian Civitas Dei, the city of God. Central to Winant's immense historical rupture, therefore, was the conceptual break made with the Greco-Roman cum Judeo-Christian premise of a non-homogeneity of substance, and thereby of an ontological distinction between the supralunar and the sublunar, heaven and earth, as the break that was to make possible the rise of a non-adaptive and therefore natural scientific mode of cognition with respect to the objective set of facts of the physical level of reality with respect to what was happening out there. The 15th century voyages of the Portuguese to and around Africa, then to the east, as well as Columbus's voyage across an until then held to be by Western Europeans non-navigable Atlantic Ocean, since both of these areas, Black Africa and the Americas, had been held to be uninhabitable, the one because too hot and the other because underwater, with both being outside God's providential grace, were themselves expressions of the same overall process of self-transformation. This as the process that, internal to late medieval Latin Christian Europe, was to underpin the rise of the modern political city and the monarchical states of Europe, and that, together with an ongoing commercial revolution, were to effectively displace the theologically absolute hegemony of the Church, together with that of its celibate clergy, over the lay or secular world, replacing it with that of their, i.e. the monarchical states, politically absolute own. The new conceptual ground of this reversal had, however, been made possible only on the basis of the intellectual revolution of Renaissance humanists, a revolution that, while allied to the reform movement of Christian humanism, was mounted in large part from the counter-perspective of the lay intelligentsia. From the viewpoint, therefore, of the category whose members had until then been compelled to think and work within the very theocentric paradigms that legitimated the dominance of the post-Gregorian Reformed Church and its celibate clergy, the name clergy means, in Greek, the chosen, over the lay world, as these paradigms had been elaborated in the context of the then hegemonic scholastic order of knowledge of medieval Europe. This theological condemnation of natural man, of the laity, had become even more intensified by medieval scholasticism's reconception of the human in Aristotelian unmoved/mover terms. Its omnipotent God had created the world for the sake of his own glory, thereby creating mankind only contingently and without any consideration for its own sake. Propter nos homines, for our human sake, had left it in the wake of the Adamic fall and its subsequent enslavement to the fallen flesh, without any hope of being able to have any valid knowledge of reality except through the mediation of the very paradigms that excluded any such hope. Given that it was precisely these theologically absolute paradigms that, by circularly verifying the sinful by nature cognitive incapacity of fallen mankind, served at the same time to validate both the hegemony of the Church and of the celibate clergy over the lay world, including the state, as well as the hegemony of the supra-temporal perspective of the Church, based on its represented access to divine eternal truth, over any knowledge generated from the local temporal and this worldly perspective of a lay world ostensibly entrapped in the fallen time of the secular realm. This thereby subjected mankind to the instability and chaos of the capricious whims of fortune. The lay intelligentsia of medieval Europe had, therefore, found themselves in a situation in whose context, in order to be learned and accomplished scholars, they had to be accomplices in the production of a politics of truth that subordinated their own lay world and its perspective on reality to that of the Church and of the clergy. Accomplices also in the continued theoretical elaboration of a theocentric descriptive statement of the human, in whose terms they were always already the embodied bearers of its postulate of significant ill, that of enslavement to the original sin, an ill curable or redeemable only through the mediation of the Church and the clergy, and circularly through that of the theologically absolute paradigms that verified the hegemony of the latter. The manifesto, put forward from the perspective of the laity, that was to make possible the rupture in whose terms the Copernican revolution and the new epoch that would become that of the modern world were to be made possible, was that of the 15th century treatise by the Italian humanist Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, entitled Oration on the Dignity of Man. In this treatise, Pico rewrote the Judeo-Christian origin narrative of Genesis, Adam, rather than having been placed in the Garden of Eden, then having fallen, then having been expelled with Eve from the garden by God, is shown by Pico to not have fallen at all. Instead, he had come into existence when God, having completed his creation and wanting someone to admire his works, had created man on a model unique to him, and then placed him at the center/midpoint of the hierarchy of this creation, commanding him to make of himself what he willed to be, to decide for himself whether to fall to the level of the beasts by giving in to his passions, or through the use of his reason to rise to the level of angels. See Picos's guide quote. It was therefore to be on the basis of this new conception and of its related civic humanist reformulation that man was to be invented in its first form as the rational political subject of the state, as one who displayed his reason by primarily adhering to the laws of the state, rather than, as before, in seeking to redeem himself from the enslavement to original sin by primarily adhering to the prohibitions of the church. Two strategies were made use of in order to effect this de-godding, if at first only in hybridly religio-secular terms, of the descriptive statement, in whose terms humans inscript and institute themselves/ourselves as this or that genre of being human. The strategy was that of return, the return by the humanists to Greco-Roman thought, to, in the case of Pico, the Jewish mystical tradition of the Kabbalah, as well as to the even earlier Egyptian thought as transmitted through these latter, in order to find both a space outside the terms of the medieval order's descriptive statement and an alternative model to which to reinvent the matrix optimally redeemed in the spirit self of the Christian, the subject of the church, as that of the rational self of man, as political subject of the state. While it was the revalorization of natural man that was implicit in this overall return to the Greco-Roman and other pre-Christian thought, and models by Renaissance humanists such as Ficino and Pico, as Fernand Halen, 1990, has proposed, that was to make possible Copernicus's intellectual challenge to the ontological distinction between the superlunar and the sublunar realms of the cosmos, to its foundational premise of a non-homogeneity of substance between them. Why was this the case? Within the terms of the medieval order's theocentric conception of the relation between a totally omnipotent God and contingently created humans, the latter could not attempt to gain valid knowledge of physical reality by basing him/herself on the regularity of its laws of functioning. Seeing that God, as an absolute and unbound God, could arbitrarily intervene in the accustomed course of nature, cursus solitus naturae, in order to alter its processes of functioning by means of miracles, at any time he wished to do so. It was therefore to be, as Hallen proposes, the humanists' revalorized conception of a more egalitarian relation between natural man and a Christian God, reconceived as a caring father who had created the universe specifically for man's sake, propter nos homines, for our human sake, that provided the counterground for the Copernican rupture within the orthodox Christianized astronomy that had been inherited from the Greeks. It was the new premise that God had created the world/universe for mankind's sake, as a premise that ensured that he would have had to make it according to rational, non-arbitrary rules that could be knowable by the beings that he had made it for, that would lead to Copernicus's declaration, against the epistemological resignation of the Ptolemaic astronomy, which said that such knowledge was not available for mere mortals, that since the universe had been made for our sake by the best and wisest of master craftsmen, it had to be knowable. See Copernicus, guide quote. In his book, The Medieval Imagination, Jacques Le Goff analyzes the way in which the medieval order of Latin Christian Europe had organized itself about a value principle or master code that had been actualized in the empirical relation between the celibate category of the clergy as the embodiment of the spirit and the non-celibate category of the laity as the embodiment of the fallen flesh. This spirit/flesh code had then been projected onto the physical cosmos, precisely onto the represented non-homogeneity of substance between the spiritual spatial perfection of the heavens, whose supralunar bodies were imagined to move in harmonious and perfectly circular motions, as opposed to the sublunar realm of Earth, which, as the abode of a post-Adamic fallen mankind, had to be at the center of the universe as its dregs, and in addition to be not only non-moving as it is sensed by us to be, but to be so because divinely condemned to be non-moving in the wake of the fall. However, it was not only the earth that had to be known in these adaptive truth-for terms within the conceptual framework of the Christian Ptolemaic astronomy of the time. The geography of earth had also had to be known in parallel spirits/flesh terms as being divided up between, on one hand, its temperate regions centered on Jerusalem, regions that, because held up above the element of water by God's providential grace, were habitable, and on the other, those realms that, because outside this grace, had to be uninhabitable. Before the 15th century voyages of the Portuguese and Columbus, which disproved this premise of the non-homogeneity of the Earth's geography, the torrid zone beyond the bulge of Cape Bojador on the upper coast of Africa had therefore had to be known as too hot for habitation, while the Western Hemisphere had to be known as being devoid of land, seeing that all land there had to remain in the framework of the Christian Aristotelian physics submerged in its natural place under water, since ostensibly not held unnaturally above the water by divine grace. This series of symbolically coded spirit/flesh representations mapped upon the space of otherness of the physical cosmos had not only functioned to absolutize the theocentric descriptive statement of the human, its master code of symbolic life, the spirit, and death, the flesh, together with that statement's overall explanatory thesis of supernatural causation. It had also served to absolutize a general order of existence, together with its postulate of significant ill, whose mode of affliction then logically calls for the particular plan of salvation or redemptive cure able to cure the specific ill that threatened all the subjects of the order, in order to redeem them from its threat of annihilation/negation that is common to all religions. Girardot, 1988. Now, in specific Judeo-Christian formulation, the postulate of significant ill had, of course, been that of mankind's enslavement to original sin, with his/her fallen state placing him/her outside God's grace, except when redeemed from this ill by the sacrament of baptism as administered by the clergy. While this behavior-motivating schema had itself also been anchored on the spirit/flesh, inside/outside God's grace, ill/cure system of symbolic representations attached to the represented supra/sublunar non-homogeneity of substance of the physical cosmos, as well as to the habitable/uninhabitable geography of the earth. Here the argument identifies Girardot's schemas as ones that also function beyond the limits of original religious modalities, seeing them instead in the terms of Danieli's hypothesis as forms of the central behavior-motivating/demotivating discursive good/evil postulates, able to activate the biochemical reward and punishment mechanism, and therefore as the central machinery of programming that is common to all human orders, whether religious or secular. In consequence, whether religious or secular, all such schemas/programs and their formulations of a general order of existence also function to inscribe the specific descriptive statement of the human that is enacting of the ontogeny/sociogeny, nature, culture, mode of being human, for whom the specific ensemble of motivated behaviors will be adaptively advantageous. In this conceptual framework, it can therefore be recognized that it was in the context of the humanist redescribing of the Christian definition of the human, in new, revalorizing, and, so to speak, propter nos homines, or in man-centric terms, that the series of the 15th century voyages on whose basis the West began its global expansion voyages, one of which proved that the earth was homogeneously habitable by humans, seeing that the torrid zone was indeed inhabited, as was that of the land of the Western Hemisphere, which turned out to be above water, together with the Copernicus's new astronomy, which proposed that the earth also moved about the sun, projected as the center, and was therefore of the same substance as, homogeneous with, the heavenly bodies, were to initiate the rupture that would lead to the rise of the physical sciences. thereby to a new order of cognition in which the objective set of facts of the physical level of reality was now to be gradually freed from having to be known in the adaptive terms of a truth force specific to each order, as they had been millennially to be known as they were and are out there. What needs to be emphasized here is, firstly, that the two orthodox suppositions that were now to be swept away, that of the homogeneity of the geography of the earth and that of the non-homogeneity of the earth and the heavens, had been ones indispensable to the conservation of the medieval order's theocentric description of the human. Secondly, it had been the reinvention by the lay humanists of the Renaissance of the matrix identity Christian in terms of the new descriptive statement of man as a political subject, allied to the historical rise and expansion of the modern state, for whom eventually these earlier orthodox presuppositions, their truths for, were expendable because no longer of any adaptive advantage to its own instituting as such a mode of being human, that had made the sweeping away of the earlier unquestioned principles of non-homogeneity possible. This sweeping away led a later Isaac Newton to exult that, because it had now been shown that all parts of the universe were made from the same forces of the same matter, one could now be able to extrapolate from the bodies nearest to us, and on the analogy of nature always consonant with itself, what the bodies furthest from us had necessarily to be. Funkenstein, 1986. To sum up, this means that the epochal rupture that was set in motion by Western intellectuals, by means of which human knowledge of the physical cosmos would be freed from having to be known in the adaptive, truth-for terms that had been hitherto indispensable to the instituting of all human orders and their respective modes/genres of being human, the rupture that was to lead to the gradual development of the physical sciences had been made possible only by the no less epochal reinvention of Western Europe's matrix Judeo-Christian genre of the human, in its first secularizing, if still hybridly religio-secular terms, as man of the rational self and the political subject of the state, in the reoccupied place of the true Christian self, or mode of sociogeny of Latin Christian Europe, by the reinvention also of the secular entity of the West in the reoccupied place of the latter, with this reinvention being based on the model of Virgil's Roman imperial epic. This takes us back to the negative aspect of the dialectical process of historical transformation, by which the West was to limit and initiate the first phase of the degodding of its descriptive statement of the human, thereby also initiating the processes that were to lead to the development of the new order of non-adaptive cognition, that is, the natural sciences. Since it was to be in the specific terms of this reinvention, one in which, as Christians, the people of the West could see themselves as one religious genre of the human, even when they were convinced that theirs was the only true religion, and indeed, as Lyotard points out, were unable to conceive of an other to what they called God, as man, they could now not only come to overrepresent their conception of the human, by means of a sustained rhetorical strategy based on the topos of iconicity, as the human, thereby coming to invent, label, and institutionalize the indigenous peoples of the Americas, as well as the transported enslaved black Africans, as the physical referent of the projected irrational/subrational human other to its civic humanist rational self-conception. The West would therefore remain unable from then on to conceive of an other to what it calls human, an other, therefore, to its correlated postulates of power, truth, freedom. All other modes of being would instead have to be seen not as the alternative modes of human that they are out there, but adaptively as the lack of the West's ontologically absolute self-description. This at the same time as its genuine difference from all others, i.e. its secularizing reinvention of its matrix religious identity from the Renaissance onwards as that of man in two forms, one ratiocentric and still hybridly religio-secular, the other purely secular and biocentric, would remain overseen, even non-theorizable, within the acultural premise on whose bias it had affected the reinvention of its matrix Christian genre or theological descriptive statement of the human. This central oversight would then enable both Western and Westernized intellectuals to systemically repress what Geertz has identified as the fugitive truth of its own local culturality, of, in Bruno Latour's terms, its specific constitution with a capital C, or cultural constitution that underlies and charters our present order as the parallel constitutions of all other human orders that Western anthropologists have brilliantly elucidated underlie and charter all other human orders. Doing so according to the same hybrid nature-culture ontogeny, sociogeny laws or rules. Within this systemic repression, ensuring that we oversee, thereby failing to recognize, the culture and class-specific relativity of our present mode of being human, man in the second, transhumed, and now purely biocentric and homo economicus form of that first invention that was to lead to Winant's immense historical rupture, to Keanu's race/ethnicism complex, and to Mignolo's modernity coloniality complementarity. What were the specific terms of that first reinvention, of its overrepresentation? Why were these terms to lie at the basis of the Las Casas Sepulveda dispute, whose empirical outcome in favor of the latter's humanist arguments, as opposed to Las Casas' still theologically grounded ones, was to provide legitimated ground for what was to become the colonizer, both the metropolitan imperialists and the settler enforcers, versus colonized relation, both Indians and Negroes on the one hand and the settlers as Creoles subjugated to the metropolitan peninsulaires, whether those of Spain, England, or France, on the other. So the next part Sylvia Wynter provides us is the Las Casas Sepulveda dispute and the paradox of the humanist invention/overrepresentation of man on the coloniality of secular being, the instituting of human others. But I'm going to stop recording right there.